My name is Jack Ryder. I am, by trade and by temperament, a man who deals in facts. For 12 years, I was an investigative journalist, the kind who built a career on verifiable sources, cross-reference data, and the unshakable belief that every mystery has a rational core. My world was one of evidence and consequence. That world ended 9 months ago with a story I got wrong. A single misattributed source, a rush to judgment, and a man's life was irrevocably shattered. Mine was merely ruined. In the aftermath, the silence from my former colleagues was deafening, a void where a career used to be. I found myself adrift, a pariah in the only profession I ever knew, haunted by the ghost of my own fallibility. Which is how I came to be driving down a forgotten stretch of county highway at 11 o'clock at night, heading for a job that felt less like a new beginning and more like a form of penance. The position was for the night shift operator at WKAQ-AM, a radio station so old and obscure it felt like a myth. The pay was negligible, the hours were antisocial, and the duties, I was told, were minimal. It was perfect. It was an escape into isolation, a place where I could no longer hurt anyone with my words, because, for the most part, there would be no one to listen. The station itself was a monument to obsolescence, a squat brick building standing alone in a clearing carved out of a dense pine forest, miles from the nearest town. A single, rust-streaked transmission tower rose behind it, a skeletal finger pointing at a starless sky. The only light came from a bare bulb above the steel, reinforced front door, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters in the light breeze. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth. It was the kind of profound quiet that presses in on you, making the sound of your own heartbeat feel like an intrusion. The man who met me was named Arthur. He was a wisp of a man, with skin like parchment and eyes that held the deep, weary resignation of someone who has seen too much and slept too little. He didn't offer a handshake. He just handed me a heavy brass key. "She's all yours until 6, he said, his voice a dry rustle. "Everything you need to know is in there." He gestured vaguely toward the door before turning and shuffling to his beat. Up sedan without another word. I was left alone in the humming silence, the key feeling cold and heavy in my palm. The inside of WKAQ-AM was a step back in time. It smelled of hot dust ozone, and something else, a faint, metallic tang like old blood. The lobby was empty save for a few framed, faded photographs of smiling men in suits from the 1930s and 40s, the station's founding fathers. A hallway led to the broadcast booth, the heart of the station. It was a small, claustrophobic room, dominated by a massive mixing console that looked like something salvaged from a World War II submarine. Racks of aging equipment lined one wall, their VU meters dark and still. I recognized some of the gear from my college broadcasting course's reel-to-reel tape decks, patch bays with a spaghetti of cables, and, behind a mesh grate, the faint orange glow of vacuum tube amplifiers. The place was a working museum, a pocket of the 20th century preserved in amber. Taped to the console, right next to the main microphone, was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age and encased in cloudy, peeling laminate. The text was typewritten, the letters faded but legible. Arthur's words came back to lean in thing you need to know is now. I leaned in to read it. Out rules for the WKKQ. I'm not Cave 1. Log all played tracks, public service announcements, and commercials in the station binder. Accuracy is paramount. 2. If you see a face in the reflection of the booth window that isn't yours, do not acknowledge it. It is a symptom of fatigue and will lose interest if ignored. 3. At precisely 3:33 a.m., the rotary phone on the desk will ring. Do not speak. Listen to the breathing on the other end for exactly 10 seconds, then hang up. Do not exceed 10 seconds. 4. Never, under any circumstances, Play the record from the plain red sleeve stored in the bottom drawer. It is not in the station's official rotation. If the equipment produces a loud, rhythmic put sound, a phenomenon known as motorboating, immediately turn off the main amplifier using the red switch for a full 60 seconds. Do not speak into the microphone until the sound has completely ceased. 6. Dead air is not an option, it is a vacancy. I read the list twice, a humorless smile touching my lips. It was exactly the kind of bizarre folklore I'd expect from a place like this. The accumulated superstitions of lonely, sleep-deprived men. The rules were a perfect blend of the mundane and the melodramatic. Accuracy is paramount. That one felt like a personal jab. The face in the window, the cryptic phone call, classic ghost story tropes. The red-sleeved record was pure forbidden fruit, a test of curiosity. Rule 5 was interesting. Motorboating was a real technical issue with old tube amps, a sign of oscillating feedback. Grounding one of the rules in a verifiable technical glitch was a clever touch. It lent a sliver of credibility to the whole absurd list. But Rule 6, dead air is not an option. It is a vacancy. That one was different. It wasn't a practical instruction. It was poetry, dark and unsettling. It hinted at a deeper, more abstract fear. In broadcasting, dead air is the ultimate failure, a cardinal sin. But here, the rule framed it as something more, as if the silence itself was a space waiting to be filled by something unwelcome. For the first few hours, the job was as mind-numbingly simple as advertised. The playlist was automated, a digital stream of soft rock and forgotten pop hits from the 70s and 80s fed into the ancient analog system. My only tasks were to monitor the levels, read a pre-recorded weather forecast on the hour, and log the commercials that ran every 15 minutes. The station binder was thick with decades of entries, a meticulous record kept by my nocturnal predecessors. The isolation was total. The booth was soundproofed, cutting me off from the world. Outside the thick plate glass window, the forest was a wall of impenetrable black. Inside, the only sounds were the soft hum of the equipment and the whisper of the ventilation. It was in this profound quiet that I first heard it. It started as a faint crackle in my headphones, a sound like static from a distant storm. I checked the board. All levels were normal. The sound persisted, a low, intermittent hiss. My mind, trained to diagnose problems, immediately began cycling through possibilities. It could be radio frequency interference, or RFI, maybe from a passing vehicle or a faulty power line nearby. Or, more likely, it was a symptom of a failing preamp tube in one of the ancient amplifiers. Old tubes were notorious for this kind of noise as their internal components degraded. It was a problem with a logical physical cause. I felt a sense of relief in this diagnosis. I was still in the world of facts of cause and effect. But as the minutes stretched into hours, the nature of the sound began to shift. The crackle wasn't entirely random. There was a rhythm to it, a cadence. For a fleeting moment, underneath the hiss, I thought I heard a voice, a faint, indistinct murmur, like a conversation in a distant room. I pulled the headphones off, my heart suddenly beating faster. The booth was silent. I put them back on. The sound was still there, a ghost in the machine. This, I told myself, was a well-documented psychological phenomenon. Auditory pareidolia, the brain's tendency to perceive patterns in random noise, especially during periods of sensory deprivation or heightened stress. Pilots on long, monotonous flights experience it. People in solitary confinement report it. I was alone, in the dead of night, in a silent room, listening to low-fidelity static. My brain was simply trying to fill the void, to create meaning where there was none. It was a symptom of my environment, not a feature of it. I was in control. I clung to that thought like a life raft. I focused on my duties, my handwriting in the logbook neat and precise. I read the 2 a.m. weather report, my voice smooth and professional, a mask of normalcy. I played the commercials for a local car dealership and a 24-hour diner. I was a DJ. This was a radio station. Everything was normal. Then, at 3:32 a.m., my gaze fell upon the old rotary phone on the corner of the desk. It was a heavy, black bakelite thing, a museum piece. It wasn't even connected to the main console. I assumed it was just a prop, another piece of the station's vintage decor. As the digital clock on the console flipped to 373300, the phone let out a shrill, metallic ring that cut through the air like a blade. The sound was so jarring, so real, that I flinched back in my chair. It rang again, a piercing, insistent summons. My blood ran cold. Every rational instinct screamed at me. It was a prank. It was a coincidence. It was Arthur, the old man, having a laugh at the new guy's expense. But the rule was not a suggestion. It was an instruction, precise and absolute. Answer it. Do not speak. Listen for exactly 10 seconds. My hand trembled as I reached for the receiver. The plastic felt cold and brittle, charged with a strange energy. My mind was a battlefield. The journalist in me, the man of facts, wanted to defy the absurd ritual, to speak, to demand an explanation, to expose the foolishness of it all. But the other part of me, the part that had been shaped by a catastrophic failure, was terrified of being wrong again. What if this was the one time the impossible was real? The phone rang a third time. I took a breath, lifted the heavy receiver to my ear, and plunged into the unknown. The receiver was slick with sweat in my hand. I pressed it to my ear, my knuckles white. The line was silent for a beat, a dead, hollow void. Then the breathing started. It wasn't the sound of a prank call, no teenager holding the phone too close to their mouth. This was a wet, rag sound, thick with fluid, like the last gasps of a drowning man. Each inhalation was a desperate, sucking pull. Each exhalation a rattling sigh that seemed to vibrate through the plastic and into the bones of my skull. It was a sound of profound and ancient suffering. I started counting, my lips moving silently, the numbers a desperate mantra against the rising tide of panic. 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. The rule was explicit, exactly 10 seconds. My journalistic instincts, the part of me that always pushed for more information, screamed to stay on the line, to listen for a clue, a word, anything. But the chillingly precise terror of the situation, the part of me that now knew the cost of being wrong, took over. 9,000, 10,000. I didn't just hang up. I slammed the receiver back into its cradle with a crack of bakelite that echoed in the soundproofed booth. The silence that rushed back in was somehow worse than the breathing had been. It felt heavy, watchful. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stared at the phone, expecting it to ring again, but it remained inert, a black, silent relic on the desk. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. A recording triggered by a timer. A clever bit of psychological warfare, designed by Arthur to weed out anyone who couldn't handle the isolation. But the sound had felt too immediate, too organic. And the phone itself, I leaned over and traced the cord. It wasn't plugged into the wall or the console. It was a thick, fabric-wrapped cord that simply snaked behind the desk and disappeared into a dark, dusty hole in the floorboards. It wasn't connected to anything. I needed to ground myself, to reclaim the world of facts. I put my headphones back on, the familiar weight a small comfort. The soft rock playlist was still murmuring, a bland and cheerful counterpoint to the cold dread coiling in my stomach. I focused on the music, on the steady green lights of the VU meters. But the static I'd heard earlier was back, and it was different now. It was louder, more insistent. And through the hiss, a new sound emerged, pushing through the veil of noise. It was a voice, a woman's voice, calm, dispassionate, and speaking in what sounded like German. It wasn't part of a song or an ad. It was clear, measured, and utterly out of place. Zoe, F, and F. The words repeated, followed by a new sequence. My blood ran cold, but another, older instinct took over. I snatched a pen and started scribbling on a legal pad, my hand moving with a long-forgotten urgency. Veer. Sex. Dree. I recognized it immediately. It was a numbers station. A ghost from the Cold War, a method for intelligence agencies to broadcast coded messages to spies in the field. I'd read about them, of course, filed them away as a historical curiosity. They were supposed to be relics, transmitted on obscure shortwave frequencies, not bleeding into the broadcast of a commercial AM station in the middle of nowhere. The voice continued its hypnotic, meaningless recitation. A stream of digits that could mean anything or nothing. It was a puzzle, a mystery dropped right into my lap. For a moment, the fear was replaced by a surge of adrenaline, the thrill of the chase I hadn't felt in months. I was so focused on transcribing the numbers, my head bent over the pad, that I didn't notice the change in the booth window at first. It was a subtle shift in the reflection. I saw myself, pale and hunched under the dim console lights, and for a horrifying heart-stopping instant, I wasn't alone. A face was there, superimposed over my shoulder in the glass. It was pale and indistinct, its features blurred as if seen through water. But there was no mistaking the two wide, dark pools that were its eyes, or the lipless, gaping maw of its mouth, stretched open in a silent, eternal scream. I recoiled, a strangled cry catching in my throat. I spun around in my chair, my eyes darting into the darkened hallway behind me. Nothing. The hallway was empty. The only sound was the hum of the equipment and my own ragged breathing. My gaze snapped back to the window. Only my own terrified reflection stared back. Rule Fate 2 flashed in my mind, a lifeline in a sea of terror. If you see a face in the reflection of the booth window that isn't your pull, do not acknowledge it. It is a symptom of fatigue and will lose interest if ignored. Fatigue. Sensory deprivation. My rational mind latched onto the words. I was tired, stressed, and isolated in a soundproof room. My brain was simply misfiring, projecting my own fear onto the glass, creating patterns from the noise and shadows. It was an auditory and visual pareidolia, a waking nightmare brought on by the environment. I had to believe that. I forced myself to turn away from the window, my body rigid. I would not acknowledge it. I would not give it power. The numbers station broadcast had faded, replaced by the gentle strumming of a forgotten folk rock song. The silence from the phone remained unbroken. The face did not return, but the sense of being watched was now a physical presence, a weight on my shoulders. I needed answers, not theories, not psychological explanations, facts. I pulled the station's logbook toward me again. It was a thick, leather-bound volume, its pages brittle with age. I flipped past my own neat, methodical entries from the beginning of my shift. I went back, past years of unremarkable nights, until the handwriting changed, becoming a cramped, spidery script from the 1970s. The entries were signed by a DJ named Albert or AL. For weeks, the logs were routine. Song titles, commercial spots, weather reports. Then, I found it. An entry dated October 12, 1978. In the margins next to the 3:30 entry, Al had scrawled, "Phone rang, 3:33. Listen too long. I think it knows my name." My breath hitched. I read on, my fingers tracing the faded ink. A week later, October 19C. The face in the glass isn't just a reflection. It smiled tonight. It has my father's eyes. My heart pounded. I flipped through the pages, a sense of dread growing with each one. The entries became more erratic, the handwriting barely legible. Finally, on a page dated November 3, 1978, was the last entry Al ever made. It consisted of just 7 words, written with such force that the pen had torn the paper. Couldn't stand the silence. Played the red one, and below that a final chilling sentence. Dead air is not a vacancy. It's an invitation. After that date, Albert's name vanished from the logbook. A new DJ's handwriting, neat and untroubled, appeared on the next page. The red one, Rule Fay 4. Never, under any circumstances, play the record from the plain red sleeve stored in the bottom drawer. My eyes shot to the bank of drawers under the main console. The bottom one was slightly askew. With a trembling hand, I pulled it open. It grated loudly in the quiet booth. Inside, nestled among dusty spare parts and tangled cables, was a single 7-inch record. It was housed in a plain, unmarked sleeve of faded, blood-red paper. I reached in and lifted it out. It felt cold and strangely heavy. There was no label on the vinyl itself, just a black, glossy surface of silent grooves. An invitation to what? I shoved the record back in the drawer and slammed it shut. The rest of my shift passed in a haze of hyper-vigilant terror. Every pop from the aging tube amps, every gust of wind against the building, made me jump. I kept my eyes fixed on the console, refusing to look at the window. Just before 6 a.m., a pair of headlights sliced through the pine trees. Arthur's sedan crunched to a halt on the gravel outside. A few moments later, the front door opened and his shuffling footsteps echoed down the hall. He appeared at the booth door, his expression as impassive and wary as ever. I couldn't stop myself. The words tumbled out, desperate and raw. Arthur, the phone call, the face in the window, the logbook. What is this place? Arthur didn't seem surprised. He simply looked at me, his gaze ancient. He took the heavy brass key from the console where I'd placed it. "You did your job," he said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "You logged the tracks. You kept the signal going. That's all that matters." He turned to leave. "But what about Al?" I called after him. "The DJ from the 70s. What happened to him?" Arthur paused at the end of the hall, his back to me. For a long moment he didn't move. Then, without turning around, he spoke, his words dropping into the silence like stones into a deep well. "He forgot the most important rule, son." "Which one?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Dead air," Arthur said, and then he was gone, leaving me alone in the broadcast booth, as the first rays of the morning sun streamed through the window, offering no warmth at all. I drove away from WKQ-AM as the sun bled over the horizon, but the daylight brought no comfort. The world felt thin. A fragile veneer stretched over something dark and vast. Arthur's final words, "dead air," echoed in my mind, not as an explanation, but as a verdict. Sleep was impossible. My apartment, once a sanctuary, felt alien. Every shadow seemed to stretch, and the silence was filled with the phantom memory of ragged, wet breathing. I was a journalist without a story, a man of facts facing the impossible. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I started digging. My first search was for the number's station. The sequence I'd scribbled down felt like the only tangible piece of evidence from the night.
Act 2.
I plunged into the esoteric corners of the internet, forums and archives dedicated to the strange hobby of monitoring these ghost transmissions. It didn't take long. On a site called Prium, a meticulously curated catalog of these broadcasts, I found a match. The station was designated SO6, but known to hobbyists by a more evocative name, Die Geisterstimme, the ghost voice. It was a female voice speaking German, known for its calm, dispassionate delivery. According to the site, it was believed to be a transmission from the former East German Stasi, and it had officially ceased broadcasting in 1990, shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It hadn't been heard in over 30 years. Yet I had heard it. It had bled through the signal of a forgotten AM station in the middle of an American forest. Next, I searched for the station itself, WKAQ-AM, and the name from the logbook Albert. The station had almost no digital footprint, just a bare, bones entry in a federal database. But newspaper archives were my bread and butter. I scoured the digitized records of the nearest town's local paper from the late 70s. On November 5, 1978, I found it, a small article, buried on page 6. Local man missing. The man's name was Albert Hayes, a 42-year-old radio DJ. His car had been found abandoned on the county highway, just a quarter mile from the WKAQ AM station where he worked the night shift. He was never seen again. Police suspected he'd wandered into the dense pine forest and succumbed to the elements. The case went cold. The story was exactly as the logbook had foretold. Al hadn't just quit. He'd played the red record, invited in the silence, and vanished. That evening, as I drove back to the station, the dread was a physical thing, a cold knot in my gut. But it was mixed with something else, a grim, defiant resolve. This was no longer just a job, it was a story, and I would see it through to the end. Whatever that might be. I walked into the broadcast booth, armed with a digital audio recorder and a thermos of black coffee. The air inside was still and heavy, thick with the smell of dust and ozone. The rules taped to the console seemed to mock me. They weren't folklore anymore. They were laws of physics for a place that defied them. The first few hours were a tense, quiet vigil. I performed my duties with mechanical precision, my senses on a razor's edge. I logged the commercials, read the weather, and kept my eyes firmly away from the booth window. The memory of the screaming face was burned onto the back of my eyelids. The soft rock of the 70s and 80s played on, a maddeningly cheerful soundtrack to my private horror. It happened at 2:17 a.m. A loud, rhythmic put erupted from the monitor speakers, drowning out the music. It was a deep, percussive sound, like a faulty motorboat engine vibrating through the floor and up my chair. My blood froze. Rule 85. If the equipment produces a loud, rhythmic put sound, a phenomenon known as motorboating, immediately turn off the main amplifier, using the red switch for a full 60 seconds. My technical knowledge, rusty as it was, recognized the term. Motorboating was a real issue in old tube amps, a low-frequency oscillation caused by feedback in the power supply. It was a verifiable glitch, a problem with a logical cause. But Al's final entry from the logbook screamed in my mind, dead air is not a vacancy. It's an invitation. My hand trembled as it hovered over the large, red toggle switch on the main amplifier rack. The journalist in me wanted to let it continue, to record the sound, to gather data, but the man who had survived the 3:33 a.m. phone call knew better. This place didn't follow the rules of my world. It followed its own. With a deep breath, I flipped the switch. The put cut off instantly. The glowing tubes in the amplifier faded to black, the music died, and the station plunged into absolute, profound silence. Dead air, a vacancy, an invitation. The digital clock on the console began its silent, inexorable count. The silence was nothing like the quiet between songs. This was a physical presence, a crushing weight that pressed in on my eardrums. It was the sound of a void. I held my breath, my eyes scanning the darkened corners of the booth. 10 seconds. The silence deepened. 20 seconds. I heard a floorboard creak in the hallway. I knew I was alone. Arthur wouldn't be back for hours. 30 seconds. A whisper. It wasn't in my headphones, which were now silent. It wasn't from the speakers. It was in the room with me, a dry, sibilant sound from the corner behind my chair. Jack. My name. It knew my name. Just like Al had feared, my heart felt like it was going to explode. I refused to turn around. I kept my eyes locked on the clock. You got it wrong, Jack, the voice whispered, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It was a voice that was impossibly old, filled with a cold, ancient amusement. It was talking about the story that had ruined me, the misattributed source, the life I had shattered. It knew my deepest failure, my most profound shame. 45 seconds. You let your ambition blind you, it hissed. You didn't check the facts. You just wanted the story. You ruined him. A word from you was all it took. Each word was a scalpel carving away my composure, exposing the raw nerve of my guilt. This wasn't a random haunting. It was personal. It was a predator that had studied its prey. 55 seconds. The whisper was closer now, right behind my ear. I could feel a cold spot on the back of my neck. What will a word from me do to you? The clock ticked to 60. I didn't wait. I slammed my hand down on the red switch. The amplifier hummed back to life, the vacuum tubes flickering, then glowing with their steady orange light. A moment later, the cheerful chords of a forgotten pop song filled the booth, loud and jarring and the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The whisper was gone. The cold spot on my neck vanished. I was alone again. I sat there for a long time shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I finally understood. The rules weren't just a list of quirks and superstitions. They were a containment protocol, a series of desperate measures designed by generations of lonely men to keep the silence at bay. Because in the silence, the vacancy gets filled, and the thing that fills it knows you. My eyes drifted to the bottom drawer beneath the console, the one with the plain red sleeve. The one Al had played. I no longer saw it as a mystery to be solved. I saw it as a weapon, or a key, a way to create a silence so total, so absolute, that whatever was on the other side wouldn't just be invited in. It would be unleashed. I didn't go back to the station for 2 nights. I couldn't. The whisper in the dead air had followed me home. It wasn't in my apartment, not in a literal sense, but it was in the silence between my thoughts, a cold echo of my greatest failure. You got it wrong, Jack. The words were a brand on my psyche. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't just a random specter haunting a forgotten building. It was a predator that knew my scent, my specific wounds. It had turned my own history into a weapon against me. Sleep offered no escape, only disjointed nightmares of static and screaming faces in glass. During the day, I was a man possessed, not by a spirit, but by an obsession. The journalist in me was fully awake now, fueled by a mixture of terror and a desperate need for a truth that could anchor me. I spent hours in the county's digital archives, referencing the names of the station's founders, the smiling men in the faded photographs, with property deeds, business licenses, and old news articles. Most were unremarkable businessmen from the 1930s, but one name stood out: Elias Thorne. He wasn't just an investor, he was an academic, a professor of antiquities at a small, defunct local college. His name appeared in a few obscure journals from the era, not in relation to radio technology, but to fringe archaeological theories and the study of pre-colonial folklore. One article from 1938 was titled "On Sonic Resonance and Mnemonic Echoes," a bizarre treatise that theorized certain audio frequencies could, under the right conditions, act as a key, unlocking residual psychic energy, memories, emotions, even entities, trapped in a physical location. It was dismissed by his peers as pseudoscientific nonsense, but as I read his rambling, esoteric prose, a cold dread washed over me. He wasn't just theorizing, he was writing a user manual. That night I returned to WKAQ-AM. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but it was now overlaid with a sense of purpose. I wasn't just here to survive the night, I was here to conduct the most important interview of my life. The station wasn't just a haunted house, it was a machine, a containment device. And I was beginning to understand how it worked. The rules weren't for my safety, they were for the safety of the world outside. The first few hours were the same tense routine. I logged the commercials, my hands steady. I read the weather report, my voice a mask of professional calm. I kept my eyes on the console, away from the treacherous reflections in the window. The ghost in the machine was quiet, the static in my headphones just a low, steady hiss. It was waiting at 3:33 a.m. The black rotary phone rang, its shrill cry slicing through the quiet. This time, I didn't hesitate. I picked up the receiver, my finger hovering over the digital stopwatch on my phone. The wet, ragged breathing began, a sound of immense suffering. I started the timer. The sound filled my ear, a grotesque intimacy that made my skin crawl. But this time I wasn't just a passive listener. I was analyzing it. The cadence, the rhythm, the texture of the sound. It wasn't just breathing. It was a voice stripped of language, reduced to its most primal, desperate component. It was the sound of a story trying to be told without words. At exactly 10 seconds, I hung up. I sat back, my heart pounding, but my mind was clear. The phone call, the face, the motorboating, the numbers station, they weren't separate phenomena. They were symptoms. They were the system trying to communicate, or perhaps break down. They were the cracks in the containment wall, and the red record that was the key. All's last desperate act. Couldn't stand the silence. Played the red one. He hadn't just given up, he'd tried to get an answer. He'd opened the door. My decision was made. It wasn't a choice, really. It was an inevitability. I was a journalist, and the truth was the only thing that mattered, even if it cost me everything. My career was already a ghost. My reputation was a ruin. What was left to lose? My hands trembled as I pulled open the bottom drawer. The plain red sleeve felt cold to the touch, unnaturally so. I slid the 7-inch vinyl from its paper prison. It was heavy, dense, the grooves cut deep into the black, unlabeled surface. This was Elias Thorne's key. This was the final interview. I walked over to the old turntable, a relic even among the other equipment. I placed the record on the platter. I took a deep breath, my own breathing loud in the soundproof booth. I thought of Al Hayes, who vanished into the woods. I thought of the whisper that knew my name. I thought of the man whose life I had ruined with a story. Maybe this was my penance. A final, absolute fact check. I queued up the main broadcast channel. I took the current song, a soft rock ballad, and faded it out. For a few seconds, there was only the low hum of the equipment. Then I killed the master fader. Dead air. The ultimate sin. The vacancy. The invitation. My hand moved with a strange, dreamlike certainty. I placed the needle on the edge of the red record. There was no pop, no crackle. There was only silence. But it was a different kind of silence. The hum of the equipment vanished. The whisper of the ventilation ceased. The faint, almost imperceptible sound of my own blood rushing in my ears disappeared. It was a perfect, absolute, and profound void. A silence so total it felt like a physical pressure, like being at the bottom of a deep ocean. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of nothing. It was the sound of a door swinging open into an empty universe. I stared at the spinning record, my mind reeling. This was the mnemonic echo Thorne had written about. A frequency that didn't produce sound, but erased it, creating a perfect vacuum for something else to fill. And then it began. It started not as a sound, but as a feeling. A vibration in the floor, a low thrum that resonated in my bones. The lights in the booth flickered once, twice, then held steady. But their glow seemed dimmer, colder. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of ozone and something else, something metallic and ancient, like the taste of a battery on the tongue. Through the booth window, the forest of pine trees was no longer just a wall of black. It was a shifting, liquid darkness, a tapestry of shadows that seemed to wreathe and coalesce. Then came the voice. It wasn't in my headphones. It wasn't in the room. It was everywhere. It was inside my head, a voice that was not a voice, but a pure, unfiltered thought, ancient and vast and utterly alien. "Eso," it said, the single word echoing through my consciousness with the force of a physical blow. "Y-O-U shavi open end th do r yo you my y so or sup hea sto y." I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, a specimen under a microscope. Uart silenci, the voice continued, calm, patient, eternal. Scott, oh, ends. Isart gustiana virame kind. Tishes pieci ispero atestia, isake, bit its elsko erf consolistini de ruyo ye esavilarnin, o e kania yo fires. Bu e kan uur fiers. The face in the glass appeared again, but this time it wasn't a fleeting reflection. It was solidifying on the other side of the window, pressing against it. The features were sharpening, coalescing from smoke and shadow into something horribly, recognizably human. It had my father's eyes, just as Al had written. But it had my mouth, and it was smiling. Yo, Siik. Ta-tu-ar-yuch, Joe, you are malist. The voice boomed in my mind, as the thing in the window raised a hand, its fingers long and thin like a spider's legs, and tapped gently on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was deafening in the perfect silence. Viro ll. Th-ti-ha-ti-shistoya esnovar. Teach ti-ish-ice. Why you arahasto are now w. Arahatalid tiobrodachiest. The needle on the red record reached the end of the groove. With a soft click, the turntable's arm lifted. The oppressive silence shattered, and the normal sounds of the booth rushed back in. The hum, the ventilation, my own frantic, gasping breath. But one sound was new. It was the sound of the lock on the broadcast booth door, turning slowly, deliberately, from the outside.